Namaste, my dear sisters and brothers. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Over thousands of years, human nature has remained essentially constant, and therefore, many pieces of ancient wisdom are relevant even today. Here is one chapter from the ancient Indian wisdom, which is about the foundations, the pillars of a meaningful life, a worthwhile life, a life worth living, a life that fulfills the essential purpose of life. It's simple and to understand, and we can relate to it very well. And for more details, you may go to Sri Aurobindo's The Renaissance in India and other essays on Indian culture. And there you'll find it at many points, but a particularly detailed description on the pages 161 to 165 of the latest edition. And like all the major works of Sri Aurobindo, this is also available for free download on the website of Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Pondicherry. Now, what are these four pillars? These four pillars are kama or desires, artha or the means to satisfy the desires, dharma, the sense of right and wrong, and moksha, liberation. Now let's go over these one by one. The first, kama or desires. Desires are considered the source of all misery. While that is true, there are also desires that are legitimate. And even those which are not so legitimate, unless they have been satisfied to some extent, how one would get the experience that it was not worth pursuing those desires. And it is this combination of this knowledge that desires are a source of misery, and then getting the experience of that misery in the course of satisfying those desires, whether the desires are satisfied or they remain unfulfilled. In either case, we find that they remain a source of misery. But then we need experience to verify this knowledge, to get that wisdom, to be able to really practice it and bring it into life and appreciate it. And therefore, it has been considered quite legitimate to have desires, not just needs such as food, air, water, and sex, but also even some other desires which may not be, strictly speaking, needs but wants. And there are stages in life when they can be considered very legitimate. And if that is so, then we need something to satisfy them. So, kama or desires are legitimate, and it's only when our experience has verified that the desires are a source of misery that gradually these desires start getting refined into aspirations for higher purposes. But to start with, even if they go beyond the very basic needs to things like name and fame, power and prestige, and so on, even that is legitimate. The next pillar is artha, which may be translated as money, or in a more broad sense, as the means for satisfying the desires. So, if the desires are legitimate, naturally we need to satisfy them and therefore procure the means to satisfy them. Not only procure, in some cases, even accumulate for further use, future use, when we may need more of these means to satisfy the desires, and therefore that is also legitimate. Money is only one of the means, but one of the principal means for satisfying our desires. But whatever resources are needed for satisfying those desires, to acquire those means and even to accumulate them has been considered quite valid and legitimate. Then comes the third pillar, and that is dharma. Dharma is sometimes translated these days as religion, but that is not what the original meaning was. The original meaning of dharma was a sense of right and wrong. And for that, there were ethical codes to guide us. And of course, we have the inner guide, which is always there, our divine essence, which tells us in no uncertain terms what is right and wrong if we care to listen to that voice. So, a sense of right and wrong is important while pursuing the satisfaction of desires. So, in the kama and artha, that is the desires and the means for satisfying them, had to be pursued within the framework of right and wrong. And why that is so? Because we know that the ultimate goal of life is moksha, the fourth pillar, and that is liberation. Liberation is sometimes considered something impossible in this world. And therefore, we feel moksha or liberation will be in some other world after we are dead and gone. But so far as this world is concerned, we will continue to be plagued with misery and suffering and sorrow and so on. And we cannot really get liberated from all these. The important thing is that if the kama and artha, that is the desires and the means for satisfying those desires, are pursued within the framework of right and wrong, gradually we will find that we will acquire liberation in this life itself, in this very world. And what is that liberation? Liberation from dependence on things and people for our happiness. Because when life is pursued within the framework of right and wrong, it gets filled with love. And love is expressed by giving. Love is expressed by giving what we have to those who need it. And there are plenty of opportunities. There's ample scope for expressing our love by giving what we have to those who need it in the professional life, whether as a doctor, teacher, or a manager, or a scientist, or a carpenter, or a farmer, and also in household work, whether it is cooking or doing the dishes or parenting. In each of these, there is scope for giving what we have to those who need it. And if that is so, then gradually we find that our dependence on people and things goes. Why? Because our happiness comes primarily from giving. And the joy of giving is always much better than the happiness of getting. It's not that we are not getting anything. That's how we are satisfying our desires. But our focus is on living a life within the framework of right and wrong. That's a life of love. And the choices made out of love involve giving. So if that remains the focus, then the what we acquire, what we get becomes incidental. And therefore, what happens is that our happiness comes primarily from giving, and the joy of giving is feels much better than the happiness of getting. And another important thing is that the joy that we get by giving is always in our own hands. Because giving is always in our own hands, getting is not. Nobody can stop us from loving, but we can't force anybody to love us. And therefore, as we start experiencing this higher version of happiness, which we call joy, which comes from giving, our dependence on people and things starts diminishing and eventually disappears. And that is true liberation. So one can be happy, completely independent of external circumstances, not being dependent on things, objects of desire, name and fame, and such abstract things which we get from the world. And also, we're not dependent on people to behave with us in a certain way. So our dependence on everything gradually diminishes, and we are in a state of happiness, or rather joy or delight, and eventually bliss. And that is what true liberation is. So we get liberated from the usual bondage of dependence on things and people for our happiness. So, if a life is lived in this way, then as life progresses, we find that while all these basic pillars stay, their character starts changing. The desires gradually get refined to aspirations. The means to satisfy them become less and less of money and more of the so called sadhana, the spiritual discipline. And the framework of right and wrong gradually shifts from written ethical codes towards that inner light, which is always much more certain and valid under all circumstances, unlike ethical codes, which are specific to a situation. Uh, we get unlike ethical codes which cannot be situation specific. They're generalized, but the guidance that we get from within is situation specific and sometimes even individual specific, because in the same situation two individuals might get two different types of guidance from that inner light. So, and then as a result of the refinement of the desires, the means to satisfy them, and the uh, framework of right and wrong getting more and more purified, refined, and uh, coming from a higher source, we find that we start achieving a state of liberation or moksha in this very life, in this very world. So these are the four pillars: the desires, kama, which gradually get refined into aspiration; artha, that is the means to satisfy them, which over the course of time gets refined to the spiritual discipline; and third, the dharma, or the sense of right and wrong, which gets refined starting with written ethical codes to greater dependence on that inner light, which can quickly and clearly tell us what is the right thing to do. And finally, liberation from suffering and sorrow in this world, and instead something positive happening, life getting filled with love, joy, peace, and fulfillment. Much of the sorrow and evil in the world is primarily because of the focus on the first two of these. That is, desires and the means to satisfy them receive all our attention. And if we neglect to satisfy these desires within the framework of right and wrong, not only we suffer, we also make this world a bad place, a place full of evil. So much of what is wrong with the world, much of the evil in the world, is primarily because of the exclusive pursuit of desires and the means to satisfy them any which way, without bothering about, without giving attention to what is right and wrong. And therefore, naturally, liberation is out of the question. We remain bound. So, that in short is these four pillars: kama, desires; artha, the means to satisfy them; three, dharma, that is pursuing these desires within the framework of right and wrong; and finally, fourth, the product is liberation, progressive liberation from dependence on things and people for our happiness. Thank you.